The Larkin House. Is it a New England-inspired Monterey colonial? Myths and misconceptions. And a little trivia. This presentation is about the building's architecture and construction. My sources are the Historic Structure Report for the Larkin House by California State Parks, 2 articles by architectural historian David Gebhard, a comprehensive biography by Harlan Haig and David Langham, and an article by Robert Parker detailing the costs of construction. The Larkin House was designated a California Historic Landmark in 1933 using faulty information, and 30 years later was made a National Historic Monument with the same information. And 2, people just make stuff up and put it on the internet. Here are some of the myths and misconceptions. That it was the first 2-story adobe in Monterey, or California. It is timber framed. It was built in 1835. That Larkin was responsible for this showing up in California. That Monterey was the first place it was employed, and that the origin of the style is New England. All of that is incorrect. Architectural historian David Gebhard, in his Monterey Tradition, History Reordered, describes the factors that cause the incorrect information to be submitted to the Landmark Committee. Specifically, he states, in the 1920s, there was a general awakening of people to another component of California's architectural past, beyond Mission Revival. And it was a style image which could be exploited in contemporary architectural design. He states, thus an array of historical myths was quickly assembled to explain the history of the Monterey style so that it could better fit the needs of a rising tide of American nationalism, and at the same time respond to California's desire to see itself as a unique regional place within the American scene. Gebhard cites Paul Edgar Murphy in an article, Native Architecture in Southern California, published in 1929. Inasmuch as most ships sailed from Boston, those things were Georgian in design, and their incorporation into California work produced the Monterey House, called from the town of that name. And a few years earlier, architect F. Garvin Hodson had designed a dwelling which was one of the first to be designed in the spirit of the charming old houses of Monterey, a subtle entwining of Spanish and Puritan character. And not unlike Wikipedia, once these ideas were in print, they were quoted by others as fact. Approximately 182 years old, it was built by Thomas Larkin, who owned it for 15 years, then sold it to Jacob Primer Lease in 1850. The Leases owned it for 45 years and made extensive changes. It had been sold 2 more times to people who made a few modifications, and then donated to state parks in 1957, who made a few more, including painting it white. By the way, the current color is historically accurate from 1891, when the building was stuccoed in peach. Let's look at some historic images. This is a lithograph commissioned by Larkin commemorating the 1842, short-lived, capture of Monterey by Commander Thomas Ap Catesby Jones. You can see the Larkin House with its 2-story pillars on Calle Principal. Here it is. And Calle Principal means Main Street. Here's a detail from that image showing the Larkin House. We're looking at the south side of the building, which has a shed roof contraption instead of the balcony we're familiar with, and the profile of the roof at the top of the building is gabled. Now it's hipped. Here's the shed roof. Here's the gable roof profile. This is a lithograph based on a painting by Joseph Warren Revere in 1846 of Monterey awaiting the arrival of Commodore John D. Sloat. And a detail of that showing the Larkin House above and to the right of the lady's hat, again with a gable end to the roof and what looks like a chimney on the south side. Gable, and there's the chimney. Here's a photo of the house in about 1900 when it was known as the Lease House. Notice just beyond it is a 2-story timber structure that the Leases built in 1872 as a boarding house when the property was extensively remodeled and the south balcony added. Let's see if I can get this. So here's the 2-story timber structure. Beyond it here is the White Sherman building. At the end of the wall is the House of 4 Winds. And all except the timber structure were built by Larkin. And here's that timber building, known as Rosanna Leese's boarding house, where the artists Jules Tavernier and Robert Louis Stevenson stayed. Stevenson also stayed in the main adobe house. He wrote, "It was time I was out of Monterey. The place breathed on me. To live alone in such a hole, the one object of scandal, gossip, and imaginative history, well, it was not good. And the house I lived in, though fair to see, was quietly pushing me into a decline." What do we mean by the term Monterey Style? In general, it refers to load-bearing adobe brick two-story buildings. The telling feature is the second-story balconies supported by wood piers, or balconies that are cantilevered off the second floor. Wood timbers are used for floor joists, roof rafters, and sheathing. The roofs are low-angled gable or hip and covered with wood shingles. Here is a hip roof profile. By the way, these two-story wood corridor porches or cantilevered balconies are found in Mediterranean architecture from Asia Minor across North Africa to Spain and Portugal. So much for New England. Monterey-style buildings have neoclassical or Greek revival milled woodworking details used for the shutters and paneled doors and the frames and sashes of the double-hung or casement windows. Gebhard makes the case that these woodworking details were common in many adobe and wood houses built in California at the same time, and this was not unusual considering the American, English, and Scottish woodworkers employed. There were about 40 of these structures built between 1835 and 1855 along coastal California from San Diego to Sonoma. Their construction was directly related to the economic prosperity of Mexican Alta California at the time. According to David Gebhard, there is no mention in contemporary letters and records, or in later reminiscences that would substantiate the view that Larkin and his house in Monterey prompted others to emulate the design of his house. There goes my pet theory. Here's the floor plan of the current building. On the left is the ground floor. In the lower area, note the thicker walls. Here. And at the top is a thinner walled addition. According to the Historic Structure Report, the Larkins made that addition to the west shortly after they moved in. On the right-hand side is the second floor with the thinner adobe walls. By the way, the central hallway and interior staircase that are frequently mentioned as proof of Larkin's intentional New England style are characteristic of center passage houses, which were a distinctive type by the late 17th century in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. While these states are not part of New England, it is possible, or probable, that Larkin experienced this kind of architecture before he came to California. According to the Historic Structure Report, the Larkin House was designated a National Historic Landmark based on its architectural significance. However, the architectural information is very much in error. Today, the National Park Service, on its page about the building's National Historic Landmark status, has the old architectural information. And the Wikipedia page is the perfect distillation of all the errors, and then some. According to Larkin, the first two-story adobe in Monterey was that of Juan Baptista Alvarado. It featured delicate cantilevered balconies, similar to the buildings of Mexican towns, and other Monterey adobes, such as the Estrada adobe and the Casa Soberanes. In fact, adobes with cantilevered balconies outnumber those that resemble the Larkin House. And while there's a lot of wood in its construction, the mud brick masonry walls are load-bearing. It is not timber-framed. It's stated that Larkin uniquely used smaller bricks on the second floor, but that was a common method of building tall adobe walls. An Indian named Gregorio made many of the bricks, and the mission San Carlos Borromeo de Carmelo was secularized in 1834, 1 year before construction of the house began. It was not the first two-story adobe built in California. There are 3 or 4 candidates for that, including Alpheus Thompson's adobe in Santa Barbara. Among the 4, it has the best documented dates of construction. Thompson was a successful Anglo merchant who traded between China, Hawaii, California, and the East Coast. He married into the wealthy Carrillo family and, according to his letters, began construction of his adobe in the late summer of 1834 and finished the summer of 1836. I highly recommend Larkin's biography by Harlan Haig and David Langham. Larkin kept journals, account books, day books, and letters. A great deal is known about his life that is captured in this biography, and probably more than what he would have liked shared. Larkin was an experienced merchant who traded along the east coast of the United States. In 1832, he was on his way to Monterey to do accounting work for his half-brother, John Rogers Cooper, a ship captain and merchant. Rachel Hobson Holmes was a young married woman traveling to Monterey to reunite with her ship captain husband, who was in South America at the time. Larkin and Rachel were on the same ship. They arrived in Monterey in April 1832. They both stayed at Captain Cooper's house. In May, she became pregnant with Larkin's child and retired to Santa Barbara. In October, she learned that her husband had died in March before they arrived in Monterey. In February 1833, their baby was baptized. And 8 months after learning of the death of Captain Holmes, the Larkins marry in June 1833 and return to Monterey. Larkin's biographers state, "But the money factor, especially in light of Larkin's absolutely consistent drive for wealth and his willingness to sacrifice principle to opportunity, must have played an important role in his decision to marry. It's probably not stretching a point to note that Captain Holmes's money was the primary source of funds used to build Larkin's initial trade and the Larkin House. This is reinforced by Larkin's accounts describing the cost of construction, and according to author Robert Parker, the house cost $5,000 to build, which was the approximate amount of the late Captain Holmes's estate. It's often said that the house was built in 1835, but it was built over several years. The lot was purchased in April 1835, the roof raised in September. The family moved into the construction site in November with a small child and Rachel pregnant. And 2 months later, in January 1836, he buys the first glass for the windows. A year later, Larkin writes that the house is finished, but according to the Historic Structure Report, Larkin continues to spend money on construction, and it's finished in late 1839. Just want to point out that, if I can get this to work, in January 1837, he says the house is finished, but it wasn't until August 37 that a privy was built. As a merchant, Larkin traveled to South Carolina, where they have a long tradition of Charleston singles, 3-story homes with 2 balconies. Gebhard states, Alpheus Thompson and Larkin possessed a general familiarity with the traditional 2-story balconied and porched building type existing in the southeastern United States, the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and Bermuda. In summary, it was not the first 2-story adobe in Monterey or California. It's certainly not timber framed. It was built between 1835 and 1839. Larkin was not responsible for the implementation of this design, and the origin of the style is certainly not New England. According to architectural historian David Gebhard, the Monterey style is a late provincial occurrence of the classical tradition in California.